I will try to guide you first through the discussion between Carol and Ian, and then between you and the panel. And also, I would like to say hello to everybody online, on Facebook Live and later on YouTube. You're very welcome. So what I will do now is I'll do a very brief intro to our series and to also to today's discussion, also introduce our panelists, and then we go into the thick of it, as it were. So this is a series which is called Innovation and the Welfare State. And this event today around AI and health is the last of the 6 events. So if you haven't seen it before, go to our channels, YouTube, Facebook, all of those, and you can find them online. And there are also summaries on our Medium blog, so you can read all about them. And so the idea was really to get especially the economic and innovation discussion out of the typical economics-driven GDP, R&D, all of that driven kind of discussions, and go actually towards the welfare state, public services kind of discussion. Because interestingly enough, economists actually do not know the idea of public value, which is kind of bizarre. If you look around, most developed countries have a GDPs where 30% is spent on public services, but yet we don't talk about public value. We talk about private goods, private value, and sort of we think if you aggregate them together, we get a public value. Well, we don't. And so this is the entire purpose of our institute, to really rethink the way we talk about innovation, economy, and of course then also it's logical then to talk about public services, welfare state services. And this is what we have been trying to do over these last 5 sessions, and today we go into a really exciting topic where we talk about one of the most innovative areas out there today, which is artificial intelligence, and of course something that touches us all, which is health. We all want to be healthy, we all want to have a healthier lives, and at the same time, of course, health is incredibly difficult because we are unable to define what health is. We only define diseases. So we define health through being free from diseases. So it's obviously a conflict-ridden and interesting area, if you will. And so today we have 2 really great speakers. We have, to my left here, we have Carol Sinclair. She is Associate Director of Public Health and the Intelligence Unit at NHS National Services Scotland. So long journey behind you, or maybe not so long. And a keen advocate for innovation across the public sector. And she's also the founding challenge sponsor in the Scottish Government CivTech program, and is also a member of its advisory board. And of course, Kattel is associated with our institute as well. She has been serving on our commission around innovation and industrial strategy over the last year, and she was very actively involved on our work around AI and data economy. So thank you again for that. And of course, the report is available on our website as well. So be sure to spend tonight on our website reading various materials, looking at videos. We would be very thankful. And to my left, to my far left, is Ian Hogarth, who's an entrepreneur and an angel investor with a background in machine learning. And you might use Songkick, which he found and ran. I'm a fan of the app, which is a concert service used by 17 million people each month, I'm told. I'm sure it's true. And more importantly, I think, he's the co-author of State of AI report, which was launched first time last year, and this year's edition is available tomorrow. Be sure to go to Google or whatever search engine to use and type in State of AI, which I think is a fantastic report, and gives you really a wealth of knowledge in a very succinct way. And of course, Ian also wrote last year a widely cited essay, which is called AI Nationalism. Again, I'm sure you have a lot to do tonight online. Read this one as well. It's just it's a blog post, but it's a lengthy one. It discusses why AI is really of national importance, actually, or should be. And of course, Ian is also associated with IIPP. He's a visiting professor with us. We only do everything in-house. So, and Ian will be teaching on our MPA later this year. And so why do we talk about AI? In a way, of course, there shouldn't be any, we don't really need to have any justification to talk about AI. But I think there's one very important aspect of it. I'm sure we're going to talk about it more today. If you think about capitalism and innovation, what it does really, really well, capitalism, is learning. Probably there is nothing out there that does learning so well as capitalism. But also, of course, capitalism does learning very well in a very unequal way. So if you left it to its own devices, capitalism is great at learning, but also great at distributing this learning very unequally. That's why we need state, obviously, to rectify these kind of problems. But if you think about AI, AI, of course, tends to, or wants to, what it does is really automate learning. So we have a great potential technology out there that can essentially make innovation an automated process, or to a larger degree that. And of course, if you think about it, capitalism has this tendency to inequality, so how can we counter that? And of course, this is why we, in our institute, really want to talk about AI, because if this is the future technology out there, how can we make sure that we actually shape this technology from public interest, from public value point of view? And this is what we're going to talk about today as well. So how can we do that? How can we socially shape AI and not have the problems that are potentially out there? So I think the first issue, because AI, it sounds, I also talk about it as if I know anything about AI really, but so I would like to ask you to go and first try to define for us, how do you understand AI and its relationship to health, and what we should be looking out for? What are the key tendencies and trends, if you will? And perhaps we'll start with Ian and your knowledge from the State of AI report.
So I think the term AI, although in some ways it's sort of overhyped, is useful in that it very crisply articulates the underlying ambition of the field. So anyone working in AI in a serious capacity is basically obsessed with the idea of creating human-level intelligence. Whether it's the people at DeepMind or OpenAI or Google, anyone who sort of has gravitated towards AI, that's ultimately the kind of the holy grail that they are kind of aspiring to. But within that, there's a sort of almost a more workman-like area called machine learning, which is really the area that this kind of the practical side of that ambition, which is the process of trying to take a computer, usually show it some kind of data and get the computer to learn to discriminate in a way that a human might be able to discriminate within a more narrowly bounded task. So rather than general human intelligence being able to detect objects all over the place, detect a particular kind of object, which is a number plate, something a lot more prosaic. And within machine learning, the area that has the most commercial potential at the moment is called deep learning, deep neural networks. And essentially, that's a computer where you have many sort of layers of sort of kind of simulated neurons, and you expose that field of neurons that's sort of designed to replicate the brain with more and more data, and the neurons, through a sort of clever algorithm, configure in a way that means that computer can then recognize patterns that it's seen before. And so we're talking about AI, but we're sort of really talking about machine learning. And within that area, because this is about medicine and mostly about images, we're talking about deep learning.
And Carol, how do you see that from a very practical NHS point of view? How is AI coming into your everyday life?
So almost by stealth, I think, would be the way I'd describe it, in that I am being drawn into that field because commercial partners are drawing our attention to it increasingly, and academic institutions are more and more looking at the field of data science, and that is a real workforce strength for us. The talent in the UK and in Scotland is immense. And how do you bring that academic acumen and skill to bring benefit to the public sector and health? So I'm becoming more familiar with terms, I think is the best way to describe it. So I've been doing a bit of reading, not a huge amount, to try and understand where you have that general AI capability and where you are looking at narrow AI capability. And probably within health, we're looking at that more niche, special field of AI. And there is a question being asked as to how long will the term AI actually endure. It's of today, everyone's talking about it, but what is the phrase or description we'll use of the future that says actually this is about augmented human decision making. And the other element I'm really interested in is understanding when we have confidence in the black box decision that is generated through AI, and where you need to look at an interpretive layer that sits beside that or over the top that says to a patient or a clinician, this is how we made that decision. So I'll give you a very practical example. I chose to try and take a loan the other day, so I phoned up and I checked my credit score, 999 out of 999 on Experian, and I did not get the best rate. So I wasn't very pleased. When I asked why, they couldn't tell me. Now that for me is the dark art of AI and the application of algorithms that doesn't keep control with the citizen. And that feels uncomfortable because I felt compromised, I felt somehow punished, but I had no idea what data they had looked at in order to get that decision. And I'll never know. I don't think that's acceptable within the field of health. I think we have to have transparency so that clinicians and patients and families can make decisions together based on that augmented intelligence solution that sits alongside other data.
Yeah, and I think that's really, I think one of the most exciting things about talking about AI in the context of health is that it's sort of prime time, right? So when I did my master's, I worked on an early machine learning system in 2005 that took, my professor basically said to me, here's 200 images of breast cancer biopsy data, images, and I've got, some of them are labeled as various grades of cancer, some of them are benign, and you need to make a machine learning system that can classify these, and if it's useful, we'll try and persuade the local hospital to use it. And so I sort of beavered away, made this thing, and it was useful in that it was able to do an okay diagnosis. But in the field of health, no one really wants an okay diagnosis, right? This thing was not as good as a radiologist. And what's happened in the last, I suppose 14 years since then, is that progress in the subfield of computer vision within deep learning has, in the lab, has gone through the roof. And now all of those research gains have been translated into more practical domains, like the sort of thing I was doing, and now the exact same process that I was applying back in 2005 is better than the expert in a number of different cases, like detecting cardiac arrhythmia from ECGs, or the recent work that DeepMind did with Moorfield around detecting eye disease. Like in both cases, the machine learning system is now better than the expert, and so you've got the technologies hit a level of competency that means it's sort of ready for prime time. And at the same time, we're talking about health, right? Which, as you said, is something where people feel it's on one of the most sensitive areas you could introduce a computing device. So it really is going to be, I think, the sort of area where a lot of the big battles around AI and the public sector are fought.
So the phrase, excuse me, determining public benefit. So what is the benefit to the public, and how do we preserve and protect privacy? So we know that how to anonymise or de-identify data. We do that every day. We already have a huge amount of data that's consented and unconsented, but it's allowed to be used because we've got the governance right, and we know where to take these conversations to get approval. What we haven't got, and I think you were touching on, Ian, is the confidence that we've had enough of these applications coming forward that ask us to think about how do we give access to third-party organisations to a huge volume of data that allows them to create value for a global market. And the thing that I think we're still probably in early days around is, what is the wealth associated with the black oil or the new gold? Data and gold, data is oil. We've got huge amounts of data. People want to come and do business with us. But what we have to do is understand what is the inherent value and return that to the NHS. And how do you do that? Because you could look at royalties. I won't go into specific details, but we're not yet sure whether an MHRA approved device, because software is now a medical device, and you need regulatory approval to deploy it. but we don't know whether that's only going to be a device that can work on a care pathway in Scotland, or it can work on a care pathway in every country. So going for royalties is probably not necessarily the right thing. Equity might not be the right thing. So we're having to come into this as public sector leaders and managers with a much more commercial head on thinking, how do I make sure the intellectual property is retained in part or whole by the NHS? And that's a really challenging space, because we're bringing lawyers with us, we're bringing clinicians, we're bringing citizens, and where is that shared space for us to say, we now know how to do this well? I'm not saying we're doing it badly, we're just not doing enough of it to get the confidence.
Right. That's really interesting. And then something I want to follow up on here is actually to ask both of you to think about both the really exciting stuff you see out there happening in AI and health, but also the really dangerous things you see out there happening. So what do you see is like really exciting?
Can I do exciting? You can do that.
It's a private public, right? No.
I get the nice bit next.
You can do both.
No, I mean, I think the deep learning stuff is genuinely pretty amazing. I mean, you know, the idea that you've got a computer that has now learned to take medical images and diagnose as well as the best professional. That's pretty amazing, right? And that can be delivered at almost zero marginal cost if we want to deliver it at zero marginal cost. So that means that you theoretically could offer, you know, treatment that would normally be very expensive at much lower cost to a larger number of people. So that's great. You know, I think that's really exciting. I think there's also whole areas where machine learning is going to enable people to recover competency that they've lost. So there's a couple of really exciting things. One is a machine learning, deep learning system, again, that has been used to figure out how to translate someone's brain waves into speech. So the way it worked is they took a patient, or I think a number of patients, who had lost the ability to speak, and then they were doing sort of, I guess, open brain surgery with a sort of, I think, electrocardiography it's called, where they basically were looking at the neural activity as the patient listened to words. And they took the signal that came from the sort of the electrocardiogram and used a system to basically figure out which bits of the brain get stimulated when they hear various things. And that's already pretty cool, but what they then did is they then had the person think of things they wanted to say and inverted the system, and the machine was able to reproduce some of those things that the person was thinking. So, I mean, that's pretty amazing, right? And so that's, you know, that's very, very early. It was very basic stuff they were trying to say, but the idea that you have a system that can help someone speak again is pretty incredible. And then on a similar note, there's been some work using deep learning again to enable limb control. So taking the sort of the nerve impulses and learning how to turn that into control of a prosthetic limb, things like that. And so I think those are sort of two broad areas. One is around medical images, and the other is around restoring capacity that we might have lost.
I mean, I just think that is so exciting. I mean, it's phenomenal and fantastical in many ways, but it could be transformative for individuals. So I'm also thoughtful about where we have AI and deep learning creating solutions for a small number of people, and also to think how you take a population approach to using AI and deep learning to understand how to create behaviour change at population levels, where you see the public health challenges that we all know exist, and actually create a data environment that helps us more deeply understand how people make decisions, when they make decisions, the consequences of decisions in real time, but that data is being then fed into other systems in real time to then create additional knowledge and insight that can inform policy, it can inform a service planning and design. There's a whole range of different ways of thinking about how data and insight flows from these tools. So they consume data and they generate data. So the consumption of the data is one thing about governance and regulation. But then what we do with that information is we have a responsibility to make best use of it at a personal and population level. So you asked me to think about what's dangerous. I don't think anything in my head is dangerous. I think there are challenges, and probably it's primarily to think about how do we make sure that the data that we're training and validating these tools on, or software devices on, does not contain inherent bias. So there's a wonderful book that everybody's talking about on Twitter at the moment called Invisible Women. So much of what we design in life today does not protect me as 5'2" overweight woman. Just had to say it. If I was 5'10" and I wasn't a woman, devices, cars, medicines, clinical trials, they have inherent biases. They have flaws to them that means that we don't all enjoy the same benefit. It's not guaranteed. So if you think about the power of these software solutions that could, A, challenge the quality of the data themselves, because they learn about the quality of the data and they tell you more and more about where the incompleteness of that data comes from. And that then demands the system to respond and say, we're not gathering the right data, or the right data aren't available. How do we create those data and make them available? Because most of these devices come to us as solutions because we hold such fantastic data around health.
Yeah, I think that's, I mean, that to your point, I mean, I think that the NHS, I mean, it's not just the NHS. I mean, I think the UK is in a very unique position in that we have, we have the NHS, but we also have, the UK Biobank. We were the sort of, I suppose, the country that ultimately championed the human genome being public domain. That was a sort of British-American partnership, but the sort of the Brit was, I think, the driving force behind it not being privately owned. And we have some of the best machine learning researchers in the world. I mean, DeepMind is the world's leading research lab for AI, and they're 100 meters that way. So, I think we do have the sort of the right building blocks. What we don't yet know is quite how to synthesize those blocks together in a way that makes sense. But I think that I feel very positive about the UK's sort of opportunity here, because we've already staked out some pretty high ground. We've already said, healthcare should be kind of free at the point of use. That's sort of that's pretty baked into, I think, the sort of the British DNA. And then we've also staked out the idea of public goods within healthcare with the Biobank and with the Human Genome Project. So we've sort of kind of said, there are sort of high watermarks we want to sort of operate at when it comes to healthcare and medicine. And at the same time, I think DeepMind has been pretty trailblazing in terms of the way that they have tried to contribute to public goods themselves. So I think that their work with protein folding and trying to predict the 3D structure of proteins, which is sort of has some bearing on for example, drug discovery, that was all released and sort of given to the community at large as an open source kind of effort. So
I think the public interest question is, we have everybody here today, so people are interested. How do we create an appetite for change? Because there's always that caution or slight anxiety that who is going to get to do what with the data, and will it always be for social good? And I do have a phrase in my head that I use quite a lot, is just because you can doesn't mean you should. And what is that edge where we take ourselves to? And you've given us some fantastic examples, Ian, of the exciting things that are just at our fingertips, and how do we make sure that the money that we have available in the public sector can be used to bring those into implementation at scale, because they will challenge the way the money is currently managed and assigned, and that's a difficult shift to navigate.
Yeah, let me probe you here further on around the issues of bias, but also politics of AI, because you both sort of brought that to the foreground, if you will. That there is really a key issues around both in terms of who's doing AI. So it's very heavily male-dominated area. So you have data that shows that, of course, about data, that there is like 90% of research is done, close to 90% of research is done by male and also that, of course, it's and heavily, of course, also concentrated into very highly developed countries and China. So there is this entire issue around bias coming from this sector, if you will, and the idea of diversity. So how can we make sure that this is more of a diverse area? But also I would like to ask you about the real politics of it. So what should governments really, in terms of investment, in terms of looking at what you now have between US and China, the sort of emerging trade war around Huawei and other data companies. And so how should we, as people on the street, basically think about those issues? Because politics is also about elections. Should we also ask about our elected officials about those issues? So what do you think about both bias and politics of AI?
There's a number of things to think about. So first of all, how is policy set around these areas, and what strategies are developed within government? So I'm actually part of a conversation at the moment in Scotland about, we have a digital strategy. We now want to think about what an AI strategy for Scotland, not just health, should talk about, and what it should enable or require in terms of collaborations with commercial partners, independent sector, academia and the public sector. And interestingly, your question about women, it's a very narrow experience that I bring with me, but there's a lot of women around this in Scotland. So I don't feel that bias. Interesting enough, the Chief Executive of Data Lab, Gillian, fantastic lady, Gillian Doherty, has just been recognised in the honours list. And I do think that Kathy Sudlow is the director of the British Biobank. I think there's a change happening. I think we're probably looking at data that shows the bias has been strong. The other thing that we've explored through CivTech, which is a GovTech accelerator environment, is actually looking at the evidence for creativity and innovation. And we know that where there is gender balance, or even a slight bias towards female capacity, they are more innovative and creative. And we are making that a requirement of CivTech in terms of the companies that come in. They may come in as a male company, but they will be required to look at their workforce profile in order to be able to move forward and be seen as a competent public partner. So I think probably instinctively we're trying to address that, but also there are some really notable role models in Britain that we can think about. In health is my perspective, but Ian, you'll have a much wider understanding of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's helpful to think about the political and economic challenges as sort of being a function of what these systems are doing. So, let's just think about the example of a specific machine that's job is to diagnose a particular type of cancer from a particular type of medical image. So very, very bounded. So let's say it's breast cancer from radiology. So you've got this system here, and it will do a better job if it has more computing power. In general, and that's slightly simplified, but if it has more computing resource, it will probably do a slightly better diagnosis. And more compute requires a lot of money. The most recent groundbreaking piece of AI research by DeepMind around StarCraft, the estimate on the compute cost for that piece of work is $20 million. So, obviously that's very, 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 very blue sky stuff, but it's a lot of money, right? And then, what that says is kind of more money equals better diagnosis. And the second thing that is kind of notable is that, if you show that system more examples of breast cancer biopsy images, it will get better over time. So you can imagine if you had the system and you showed it, all of the images in Cambridge, it would be better. And then you showed it the ones from London as well, then it'd be even better. And you showed all the UK, better again. And then if you showed it all the images of all breast cancer biopsy scans ever in the entire world, it would better still again. And then the final dimension of that is that these systems are not just becoming intelligent by looking at the specific images they want to learn from. So a big kind of breakthrough area in machine learning at the moment is called transfer learning, and basically that's computers that can take intelligence from one area and kind of transfer it to another area. So specifically in the context of breast cancer biopsy images, a system that has first of all learned to recognize lots and lots of different types of objects from a large database of images can then actually do an even better job of breast cancer biopsy classification. So what you have is, more money for compute, more data, and more breast cancer data, and more general data means a better diagnosis. And anyone who's getting diagnosed for cancer wants the best possible diagnosis they can get. And that's a very, very bounded example there. But what that says is that the ideal system here is a global one, right? Because you're going to have all the global data in one place and a very efficient way of dealing with it. So then the question is, well, if it's a global, one sort of single winner-take-all global system, how is that going to come about? Is that going to be Google competing with Yahoo and Microsoft and Amazon and Apple to, I don't know why I mentioned Yahoo, they're not going to be competing. No offense to Yahoo, but...
you could say Bing next.
Yeah, exactly. So that would end up with the scenario where, for example, Google ends up with the most data, the most compute power, and they have the best breast cancer biopsy classification system. And suddenly, people sort of say, well, I want the best one, Google's got the best one, so every country ends up buying Google's one, right? So that's one variation on how this could happen. But there's another variation on how it could happen, which is to sort of say, we would like this to actually be a sort of public domain thing in the first place. And so it could be a public domain thing owned by a state, or it could be a public domain thing owned by the world. And there aren't very many examples of the latter, but we have been part in the UK of developing some of them. So the Human Genome Project is a really perfect example. It's something that was put together and is now anyone in the world can access it. It's not kind of constrained by by having to pay a private entity to get access. It's something that has been developed for sort of humanity, wherever and whatever age it wants to be used by. And this is particularly pertinent because you can kind of audit how much commercial interest there is in this topic by sort of looking at commercial patents. So within commercial patents in AI, the hottest sector is computer vision, deep learning, the stuff we've been talking about, but not just for computer vision, deep learning, computer vision and deep learning for biometrics, which is that technology applied to this topic, right? And that means that the largest number of kind of patents being applied for or granted within the entire field of AI are within medicine, and that is a private company saying we want the intellectual property relating to this discovery. And so I think we have some sort of very large macro decisions to make about how to think about this topic, and I think the problem is that the public sector tends to focus on the micro decisions, which is like, the state deciding to fund N more AI PhDs each year or something like that, something useful, but it doesn't really get to the fundamental problem of like, who owns this?
I think that is a feedback question almost to how we handled the work around AI and data economy within the Commission conversation. We didn't go to that macro question. We held ourselves down to some fairly fundamental questions about how would we even begin to go to that big question. And I suppose for us collectively it's to ask ourselves, do we want to take collective ownership of that question and to then determine what is the best possible way for that to be delivered? Because if we don't show high social interest in that question, then the commercial companies will quietly develop the patents, and suddenly they will get to a critical mass where we have no longer the opportunity to think about whether that's the right or wrong way for this to happen. And you're right, it's not bounded by the UK, it's not bounded by Europe. It is something that is far bigger, and where the money is, the decisions follow. And I think that, for me, is probably one of the scary parts, if you want a danger one. The danger signal is that suddenly it will happen out of sight, and it will then come to be.
So I think there's a sort of a good thing in the context of these questions, which is we're going to have some time, and I think that if you look at how AI is being applied in the real world in a completely different area, which is transportation, people have been talking about self-driving cars a lot, and I think a lot of people are quite excited about the idea that they wouldn't have to drive their commute, and there's lots of cost benefits and potentially safety benefits if they get good enough. And so self-driving cars is a hot topic. It's been hot topic for a while, but the most successful self-driving car company in the world, which is the one owned by Google, called Waymo, successful in terms of the number of miles driven. In the last year, Waymo drove 1 million miles, which is about, I think the average Californian drives 17,000 miles a year. So we're talking about like 500 Californians worth of miles is all that the very, very, very best self-driving car company in the world has done so far. And that's because, the moment you let a machine loose on the road, everyone's like, well, that machine better be good at turning left. Or right, as it mostly is in America.
But your point is well made, because that is the volume of data that they have available versus the volume of data that better solutions. You say that acquisition of learning that comes with volumes of data. So would there be a question to be asked then about that commercial competitiveness instead of a collaborative space? And that's where the missions come in, is that it demands collaboration. If you take a mission-led approach, is how do you demand that people bring together their learning, bring together their data for better advancement, and how would you then use policy and strategy within that political agenda and environment to say there's a better way of doing this, but there would have to still be value for the participants, because they're not going to come and say, well, we'll give it all away for nothing. Do you think there's an appetite for people to think as a collaborative solution to moving us forward faster, or do you think that's just naive?
I think it kind of goes back to that very first thing we talked about, which is sort of what's AI and what's machine learning. I think when it's machine learning, it's kind of like there's a lot of companies applying it to make money, and that's why the patents are up and all the rest of it. I think as soon as you start to really talk about AI and the idea we start to create machines that are close to human level intelligence in a general sense, everybody, even the CEOs of the largest tech companies, all start to get a bit jittery about how this works, right? Because you're talking about a far more substantial change, and so I think that there is scope, and I think that there is also time, because if self-driving car companies have been cracking at it for years now, and you've got to like a microscopic fraction of California drivers, we're not going to have all radiology scans being processed by machines anytime soon. And so that's, I think, really good in some ways that this hype that's around what this technology can do and what it will be able to do is kind of actually quite ahead of deployments, and that will give us space and time to talk about how it should be deployed.
So I think there's a question then that I have in my mind about, we're not really on a linear trajectory around this, we're on an exponential curve, and we need to be watching for where that movement happens. So you say not yet, but I don't think we're as far away from actually seeing all images being read by AI or machine learning devices. Because the question is for us, a more complex one, is that we don't have a sustainable NHS in terms of our workforce. Regardless of how many people we train and how many people we recruit, the demands, because of the way we deliver care now and because of the technology and the advancements, have been ahead of the curve of the automation. And therefore, the automation is not just about improving productivity and efficiency of a service, it is absolutely about improving outcomes. And where people are confident that that is what we're focused on, that people get the best experience, the best care and the best outcome, then productivity and efficiency is seen as very desirable because it allows the money to work differently. But it is not the reason for doing things differently. And therefore, we will begin to think about how we spend our money differently. It won't be about employing a very specialist and expensive skill set and workforce. We can use some of that money to actually think about how do you buy licenses for software devices. Do we actually introduce it as something that's at the heart of a national screening programme, for example? And these conversations are current and live.
Yeah, I think there was something really interesting Ian, you mentioned around biobanks, and I think if you go back almost like 15 years ago, you had quite a wide global and European debate actually around biobanks, who should own them, and because especially I think Iceland was one of the cases because it was privately owned, or the national biobank data was privately owned by a private company. I think that led to a very serious and significant discussions, and by now we're sort of past that. We know that this should be publicly owned. And in that sense, I'm worried that we don't have similar level of discussion around artificial intelligence and the data ownership. And I think something again I want to mention here, and looking at your State of AI report, where I get the knowledge from, is that what is really troubling in that sense is that you have there is a 30 billion investment every year going into AI, but most of it is private. If you look at the research, most top researchers by now come from Google, not from public universities or institutions. So it's for the first time in history, you have privately owned, or the drive for this new knowledge come from private sector, massively so. There is almost no government that can, apart from China perhaps, do that. And also the salaries, again from the State of AI report, the salaries for top engineers are around $1 million a year, which again, no public organization can compete with, universities can't compete with. So I think I agree that there is time, but also there is really, you can see the wave emerging from the private sector is so massively strong that we are almost, my question really is how do we get there, that we have this urgency that we had with biobanks? Everybody was discussing in 2005, we talked about the privately owned genetic data, and it was really key issue, but how do we get there?
I mean, I guess the way I feel is that it's largely a matter of raising interest in the topic within the electorate, and I think that, or certainly within the sort of the commentariat or whatever they get called nowadays, because I think right now the sort of the politicians duking it out in the US or the UK or Germany or other countries that have sort of a real base of talent in this area just aren't prioritizing this. I think Boris Johnson said something like, we need these tech wizards or something like that, right? But that's the sort of the extent of the policy proposal here. And similarly, on the left, you have sort of Corbyn talking about sort of nationalising water or rail, but not nationalising, core, technology assets. And so, I think that, in the same way that you have started, I think we in the UK should be sort of encouraged by the behaviour of the UK government around climate change. I think the MPs voted to declare a climate emergency, and the recent bill that was passed around 2050. A lot of that is just in response to sort of, popular pressure, things like Blue Planet, whatever else. And I think that there needs to be a similar popularization of kind of what's at stake here, because, ultimately we're talking about, who owns the intelligent systems that we use to do a lot of things in our lives, whether it's healthcare or transportation or all sorts of other things. And there is the potential for the state to own a lot more than they do right now. And there is also opportunity to create sort of some kind of global system that is sort of owned by many countries rather than a single state. And those are sort of, that's white space. No one's really doing that. And I think it will be something that more and more citizens advocate for when they understand kind of, well, do I really want to be paying, for access to radiology scanning in the same way that I pay, pharma companies for sort of, overly marked up, generic drugs. And so I think it's about raising the public domain. I mean, that's why we've been sort of working on that State of AI report and trying to sort of draw attention to these topics. I think that the other sort of bright spark that is going to be worth talking about is that private companies have, and some governments have historically sort of framed this debate as, well, do you want innovation or do you want privacy? Or something along those lines, right? So, and the reason that the way it's framed that is that if you want innovation, then we need all the data. And if you want privacy, well, we can't have all the data, right? And so there's this sort of, everyone thinks, well, I kind of want innovation, maybe it's okay, right? And I think one of the most exciting areas, again, it's sort of kind of quite cutting edge right now, but there's an area of machine learning research that essentially enables these intelligent machines to learn without actually ever really seeing the data they're learning on. So the techniques are called things like differential privacy, homomorphic encryption. It's quite a niche area of computer science. But what's so exciting about it is, in theory, you could have a system that learns from all the breast cancer biopsy images from every country without ever actually being given the patient's data. It just goes and uses these techniques to preserve privacy whilst also learning. And that is, that technology is basically ready today. What it doesn't have next to it is the political will to use it to do something as profound as what has been done with the biobanks. And so I'm kind of optimistic, as I think that when citizens kind of realize what's at stake, they will advocate for this stuff. And I think that the technology is kind of getting there for doing something a bit more ambitious. And what we're sort of lacking is the sort of synthesis of citizens wanting it, tech being ready, and the government saying, okay, fine, we'll do it.
And I think that's exactly getting to the heart of where I hoped we would, is where do we focus? Because we don't need to start at A and hope to end up at Z. We can probably start at T in terms of all that learning comes before, but the technology and the advancements are now so sophisticated that, as you say, we don't actually need to think about access to data. It's giving them the training environment or the learning environment that allows those products and solutions to be created. And is that where you think we should go? Because there's an education question here. It's technically really complex.
Yeah.
Climate change is, I just know I'm going to France on Saturday and it's too hot. And I'm worried. But that I remember 12 years ago, I wouldn't have been worried about going to France and it being too hot. So something's changed. So I'm personally aware and I'm thoughtful about that. Data is it's around us, it's invisible. We don't think about data every day, we're generating data all the time. Increasingly devices, we hit terms and conditions, agree, we don't even read them. When it comes to healthcare data, we think differently, because who's going to do something with that? How will I be compromised in later life? What this insurance company is going to know about me that I don't want them to know? So there has to be a question at some point about controllership, and where the citizen creates a personal wallet of data, and then there are parameters set about who can have that data. And you can still create, there's billions of data wallets thereafter. If you create that environment where enough data is available at any given time, then is that a different way about thinking about access to data?
Yeah, I think so. And I think that the self-driving car kind of analogy is interesting in that, why is it that the best self-driving car company has only driven 1 million miles? It's because some people have been killed by self-driving car companies, So, the fatality, and I think it was Arizona with the Uber's self-driving car units, and it's something where data moves from being, or these sort of intelligent systems move from being something that is kind of a bit woolly to there being very real consequences in the real world. And so I think the same will be the case with these systems in health, because again, you'll get misdiagnoses, you'll get the kind of thing that ends up on the front page of the papers, and that again will force the conversation, and it would just be nice to get as ahead of it as possible, so that we minimise the sort of the cost of it being rolled out incorrectly.
And I don't think, from the health perspective, these come forward as fast and as visibly in the media, because we've got the yellow card system. Any adverse events associated with medicines, they're notifiable. And that becomes known to a certain group of people, but it certainly doesn't hit the press. The worst thing I can remember is a clinical trial that went badly wrong, probably about 8 or 9 years ago, and it was all over the media. A group of young men who were being given treatment, their temperatures went through the roof. They thought their heads were going to explode, and literally somebody did die. And clinical trials, people very, very rarely die in clinical trials because they're so tightly regulated and controlled. But as a consequence, your learning is limited because you don't have the diversity of that research group. And what you're looking for is the greatest diversity in the data to help you to learn what safety looks like, what safe looks like. And there will always be a need to understand when you've just gone the wrong side of right, something happens. You learn from it. And that's where innovation demands learning. Innovation is learn fast, fail fast, change, learn fast, fail fast. And that, for me, is where the confidence has to come from for the citizens. But the other thing I am thoughtful about is, how do we make this visible? How do we create a social awareness, a political awareness, your question? How do we make sure people get the information in a way that they can understand it, they can react to it, they can have the blue planet conversation about what do we want for ourselves? Do we want our lives to be basically lived, supported by data and information that is being created through artificial or augmented intelligence? Are our lives going to be better? Because if our lives are going to be better, that's a really powerful draw. But I don't know that we're there yet.
Yeah, in that way, I would like to, before I open the floor to a question from the audience, ask both of you, because both of you mentioned the awareness of the citizen, if you will. So what are the things that everybody here should be doing over the next couple of days or a couple of years, even in terms of AI and health? What should people know? What should they look out for? What should they read? How should people educate themselves, and what should they demand also from their local MPs? Or what do you think is the...
I think if you were to ask local MPs, they might be a little bit bemused unless they have a personal interest. In Scotland, one of our ministers is a minister for AI. It is there, it is present and becoming more visible. Without a strategy at a government level, you're not going to get high ministerial commitment, because that is the bringing to life of that ministerial or political will and intent to do something. But when you actually look at how the money is beginning to flow around, so the city region deal monies is a good example. And within Edinburgh and South East, 6 council areas in Scotland, that city region deal is built around data science and the need to grow that skill set and to become a data capital in its own right, and to see us taking responsibility for actually understanding what we want to do as a nation or as part of the UK. But I think as a person, at a personal level, when you're interacting with the public sector services, just ask a question. How was that decision made? Is there any automation that sits behind this? Means testing, that when you're assessed whether you're going to get something or not get something. Was that a human decision, or was there something else used to supplement that decision? And start the dialogue to create interest. And where interest becomes more visible, then people have to be able to be more transparent. Not because they're being low in transparency for a bad reason. They've just not thought maybe to say this is actually how it's changing. And how do you actually manage the logistics? The Marks and Spencers, you go in on a hot sunny day and there's plenty of salad. That's not because somebody's sitting with a piece of paper going, it's going to be hot today, we're going to need 95 things. They are absolutely logistically underpinned by AI and
Totally, yeah.
Automation. And we trust that. We trust that we'll go in and we can buy what we want. How do you get the same conversation going about access to care, access to health? Because it shouldn't feel so alien, then probably it does. But
yeah,
again,
you're dead right. I think Morrison's have partnered with a company where almost all of the restocking and sort of reordering is done in an automated fashion by just tracking what's going on, and that certainly is kind of a real thing. I think for me, I think one of the things that sort of relatively universally British people are proud of is the NHS. I mean, it was sort of, I thought it was very interesting watching that Danny Boyle thing about the London Olympics, because it was quite weird, but it was one of the times where I think someone really kind of captured what makes British people proud to be British. And I think that there's a real vacuum right now around kind of defining what it means to be British in the context of Brexit, and what we want to sort of stand for post-Brexit. And I think that the demand that we should have of our sort of politicians is we want the best possible healthcare service in the world, that is the most technically advanced. And we have all of the assets in place to do that if we have the political will to do it. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's kind of the demand. So anytime you have an interaction with a hospital where everything just feels like the note systems aren't reconciled well, for example, or something like that, that's an area where it's symptomatic of not investing enough in digitizing the NHS. And I know that Matt Hancock, has been making kind of efforts in that area and is sort of a big believer in these topics. But I think personally, I would like to see the NHS employing a very, very large number of top tier computer scientists, as well as nurses and doctors and chemists,
or at least collaborating with them. And that's the question I often ask: is do we need to employ them, or do we need to actually collaborate with them? Because these are costs that are high costs, and to know that you're doing it the best possible way is seeking out collaborations, and health academic partnerships are a really rich environment to generate more of that capacity. But I think there is something that should be employed within the NHS to bring a different dimension to how we plan.
Yeah, and I think it's complicated to think about how if we do invest a lot more in our healthcare system, how do we sort of recoup some of the gains from that? Because one model is the model of the BBC, right, where the BBC content is kind of free to the citizen, but then BBC Worldwide goes and sells all of our whatever it's called, Downton Abbey or whatever, all the way around the world, and reinvest that back into BBC TV shows. So you could imagine some kind of model there with the NHS, but that gets very tricky, because then, well, if we're doing that and we're doing that really, really well, what does that mean for other countries' equivalents of the NHS? Again, it gets into all these questions of the national versus the global interest. But I think a good example of that is in drug discovery. So drug discovery is an area where machine learning is being applied at an enormous clip right now, and the idea is that you can use some of these very deep neural networks to in various different ways discover new drug candidates. And there's a bunch of startups in the space. I'm an investor in a few of them, and a lot of them have just started to get to the point where the big pharma companies are now sort of partnering with them, buying pre-licenses on things. So as a thought experiment, if the NHS said, rather than letting Google or Amazon or Tencent buy the next great UK startup doing stuff in drug discovery, the NHS buys it, invests in it, and the NHS develops loads of drugs and then licenses them. And that's just not on the table. Instead, we're talking about like Wagon and Silverlink and what we do about trains. And I think that it gets to these core questions around who owns the intelligence that we are endowing machines with right now.
There's definitely a question around ownership of intellectual property. I mean, that goes without question, and creating that sovereign value back in that we referred to earlier. I think you asked the question about how can citizens become more engaged. So I am aware that there was an exercise probably a couple of years ago in Denmark where they consulted with the public about the use of blood spot records. So if you think about it, every baby born gets a heel prick, and there's a little spot of blood that is tested for phenylketonuria. We keep those. We actually have all of those in Scotland back to 1965. If we can get to a point where we have properly describe the huge value in that data, because it's actually your genome, that would be phenomenally exciting, hugely attractive to people, that takes you into that step change conversation, because suddenly that is just a factor beyond understood in terms of what we've got in general about data.
Yeah, and I think it's just fascinating that we would, as a country, go to the effort of doing that. You know, like, it's kind of wonderful to think about it. Like, you know, somebody has thought about it, has filed it away, has been categorizing it. Like, I'm sure the storage isn't trivial, like, you know, preserving the kind of fidelity of the samples. And yet we don't really have as soon as you sort of say, well, why don't we have some software engineers in the NHS working on that in a sort of sovereign capacity, everyone says, oh, that seems weird, like, we should definitely just give it to a private company, you know? And that I think is the dialogue that needs to sort of be started.
But the sad thing was Denmark didn't manage to have the proper conversation, or they had the conversation and they had to destroy the cards because they couldn't hold the confidence in the public trust. And that is the skill that needs to be applied to these conversations. And you do need to bring the computer scientists into the room, because there are so many different aspects that need to be appreciated. If we simply have a clinician-citizen conversation, it is of a certain dynamic. If you bring a whole range of perspectives in, the richness and the understanding that you're creating through that consultation or conversation is enhanced. So I think there's a lot of learning to come in the next couple of years, as you say, about where we've come from, where we want to go. Some of us know where we want to go, some more than others. But the value that is there to be realised is just magnificent. So I think it's really exciting.
Excellent. So now it's time for you all, if you have questions, others. We take 3 questions at a time. And if you get the mic, please stand up for the cameras, for the people beyond the screens. And state your name and question. So we can start from there, the closest gentleman.
I can't help but wonder if there's a parallel here with what you've just been discussing about with the National Programme for IT that was started in the early 2000s. Major computer programme for across the country to bring in a standardised IT system. We had to bring in major IT companies like Fujitsu and Siemens at great costs. The last figure I heard was, £30 billion was thrown at the project. And in the end, it sort of seemed to just fizzle out. And we didn't have this expertise in-house, and these companies just walked away with a lot of money in their pocket. And I just wonder, could we go down the same route with this? We need a really good IT setup, which you've already mentioned in passing. Sorry, do you want my name as well?
It's fine if you don't want to say.
Okay, no, my name's Dave Hancock. I retired from the NHS as a biomedical scientist 18 months ago, and when I left, I was a little bit disillusioned, shall we say.
Thanks. Damon, you have a question?
I'm Damon Silvers. I'm with the IIPP as a visiting professor. I thought this was really fascinating in a lot of different ways, and I just want to make a couple of observations in a way following on the gentleman before me. One was the comment one of you made that in relation to putting in, to hiring AI talent into the public sector, though that we just can't afford it. And I think it's worth thinking about that the reason why the private sector can afford it, the reason why, because the revenues from AI are a little murky in a lot of these areas. The reason why the private sector can afford it is in many cases because they're benefiting from public finance, particularly through quantitative easing, which is a big complicated thing that Reiner could talk about. So the boundaries between who has the money to afford the talent and who doesn't is perhaps not what you think it is. Secondly, there's a lot of history. I'm very struck as an American, as you can probably tell, by the fact that the UK has an integrated medical database, right? That it's not split up among 1,000 insurance companies and providers and so forth. This is an extraordinary asset over time. And I think it raises this question, again, it's a finance question of how do you use that, the fact that AI is kind of worthless without data to squeeze the value out for the public. And I think that's the real question that the two of you have been kind of kicking around. And I would just observe again that if you can't afford the AI people and the lawyers to do the negotiating in a sophisticated way, then it doesn't matter that you have the data. Per my predecessor here, you'll always be taken advantage of. You have to invest in the talent to extract the value. So
Thanks.
comment on that.
Thanks. There was one more, and then we have
Matthew Dixon, it really picks up several of the comments that have just been made, but machine learning has two components. There are two components of value. One is the data set, and the other is the tool that extracts things from it. And apropos of public value, we have massive amounts of data. Why could we not patent that?
Thanks. So these three questions, whoever wants to start.
Oh, I think what I was trying to say earlier was not that we shouldn't employ them, but be clear what the proportion of your workforce should look like. So simple workforce planning, although not simple to execute ever. How would you create a multidisciplinary environment that brought in all these skills? And it may be employing them, or it may be through collaboration. And it may be through commercial collaboration agreements. So actually, I've just been involved in an agreement where we're working with a non-UK company, a European company, with 3 universities to develop an AI imaging device. And that has been thinking about how do we do that knowledge transfer. So one of the things that I asked to be written into that agreement is a number of free consultancy days every year where that company will work with us to make us an intelligent customer, that we actually are more informed about how these companies think, how they do their work, how they understand value, and how we then can better understand the value that's inherent in the data. And we do need computer scientists, AI specialists, we do need commercial lawyers who understand these spaces with deep confidence so that we can then return that value. So I think the question about the IT was that it was a traditional procurement approach. It was what we call waterfall design. We wrote the specification, we took it to the market, and we bought the partners. That really isn't how we think about procurement in the public sector very much anymore. It's much more of an agile environment where you're going with the minimum requirements because you know what you know, but you can't buy what you don't know. So you actually have to go through these iterations of design and procurement, and there's a whole lot, not a whole lot, there's a number of procurement instruments now available that enable different relationships with SMEs, startups, where you can actually go into an accelerator innovation environment without having to go to full procurement from the outset using OJU. So I think we are moving with confidence into a different way of collaborating that I hope means we don't go these places anymore. I can't say we never will, but we certainly are taking the lessons and the focus at a government level on, from the top of UK government and Scottish government, procurement and how we use the law and interpret the law has to be done differently, and that is at the front and centre of many conversations I'm part of. So I'm reassured and encouraged. I don't think we'll have got it perfectly right, but that's where we're going. I don't know if that's your experience, Ian, that you feel those conversations are changing.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I certainly think that you're right. I mean, I'm an investor in a startup that's currently, selling their service directly to consumers and also to the NHS, and it's exactly as you described, a very incremental, gradual procurement process rather than a sort of one big buy. Yeah. I think these are all really great questions because they kind of get to the heart of why you would or wouldn't trust the state to have a sort of more active role here. And I suppose the first question can kind of be boiled down to, will the state waste money in procurement? And I think that, on the optimistic side, it's easy to talk about overspend in the context of a sort of a specific piece of procurement, but at a macro level, state funded healthcare is cheaper as a percentage of GDP, right? So the UK's kind of spend per citizen is lower than the US by, I think, maybe 3x. And I think Singapore, which is also, again, mostly publicly funded, is the lowest in the world. And certainly the Americans I've talked to in sort of the tech world in America look at Singapore and the UK and think, wow, what can we learn? Not just, what shouldn't we be doing? And I think that things have gotten better. I think that the GDS sort of initiative, which was basically an attempt to bring tech talent into the state to work on digital services. This guy, Mike Bracken, who's affiliated with IIPP, ran it for a while. And I remember very vividly, actually, when that launched, because one of the engineers that worked for us at our company said, I want to leave to go and work for the government. And I was like, you what? Like, that's the last thing I expected to hear. And he said, no, there's some really brilliant people. They're going to all, they're getting involved in trying to make, the kind of the day-to-day services you use as a citizen better. And I want to join them and take a pay cut. And so I think that, people who work in the NHS often work at below market rates. And I think the same was true with GDS, and the same could be true with some kind of computer science effort within the NHS. But I think all of this basically requires political leadership at the top level who understands technology. And that is just, that we're in this interstitial period where I think people realize tech is incredibly important, potentially the most important lever we have to pull. And yet the leaders are sort of mostly non-technical. And finally, when it kind of comes to this question of kind of how much big companies spend, or the cost of all this stuff, I think it's worth contextualizing this spend relative to the UK government budget. So, for example, in the last 12 months, venture capitalists invested $27 billion, as Raina said, in AI startups globally. But the UK spends $100 billion a year on defence, right? So actually, these numbers are pretty small relative to the resources of the state, if you have leadership that wants to spend the money on it. And so, it would be possible for a future prime minister to say, I want to spend, $10 billion on technology for the NHS, that we're going to have, self-sovereign systems. But it's just, we don't talk about it in those terms. We talk about like the overspend and sort of the more negative history of how this has been done by non-technical leaders.
I'm especially struck, if I may say, by how Stephanie Kelton speaks, who was the economic advisor to Bernie Saunders in the States, wasn't she? And I've only met her twice, and I am not an economist. I'm not a statistician. I'm actually a healthcare scientist. But it was such a simple message about governments can take control of how they create money and how they spend money. And I think that is a really powerful provocation to ask of politicians, because quite often we default to there's just not enough money in the public sector, and we can't get it working differently. And yet I think there are really strong levers, as you say, for creating that different conversation. And I do think that there is something what you say about people leaving and going to a new job, and I'm not going to earn as much. We've got ex-CTO from Skyscanner working in the NHS in Scotland, because he's intrigued about what we're trying to do. And you can attract talent. It's not that you're not willing to pay the market rate, but sometimes you don't need to pay the market rate, because people actually come because of the values of the NHS or the public sector, and they want to feel that they're giving back. And that shouldn't be underestimated as an attractor to talent.
Definitely.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just to comment very briefly on the procurement issue, as you mentioned, that really broke the system was actually creation of a new institution, GDS, that was partially created on purpose to actually break down a system of essentially 7 big companies supplying most of the IT for UK government, of course, and everybody knew it was a failure by design. As you say, it's a waterfall system, and everybody knew it never works, but there is a next contract, so there is no worry. And of course, now you have 3,000 companies working for the UK government in this procurement system, so that was really the big change. But it was based on creating a new institution that relied on very different kind of talent that was brought into the public sector. So I wonder whether this is again what we need to think about AI as well. We need to create a new sort of a talent-based agency.
Yeah, I mean, it's very hard because you've got to get the right talent and you've got to have the right political leadership that it sort of understands the challenge. And I think, I think that people who live in the UK would like to see the government invest considerable resources in the future. And, I think I spend time talking to MPs about this stuff, and what I typically hear from the sort of generic Conservative MP is, have you read about British Leyland? Because we screwed this up once with a car company, so we should never talk about this. And what I hear when I talk to sort of Labour MPs is kind of like, that AI stuff sounds interesting, but we need to focus on trains, And I think that the opportunity is to really reframe this and say, let's invest that resource in sort of national competency, but let's invest it in an area where pretty much everyone is already bought into, better healthcare, and invest it in the future edge of that rather than just where we are today.
Exactly.
And I haven't mentioned it earlier, but I am absolutely convinced that this is an extremely powerful mechanism for really getting to the heart of addressing inequalities. Because a lot of what we do either preserves or worsens inequality, not because we intend to design it that way. We don't, be it whatever public sector. But when we build transport infrastructure, do we actually use all the data available about communities and what makes communities what they are? And so that things like place, this sense of place and place-based policy is really, really important. As in, health in policy is the other element, that we shouldn't see policies as being vertical instruments. They should be horizontal enablers, so that they're interacting with a whole range of other agendas. Because that's how we live our lives. We don't live our lives in neat slices. We actually interact in a very complex way with life every day, with services in that way. And the data are there and the data behave that way. We don't use the data that way. Yeah. And that's where I think AI is a huge asset for us, because we don't actually have to do the human effort that we maybe have had to do in the past to think and do differently.
Okay, let's get another round of questions. There was a gentleman over here. Are there any other?
Thanks. My name is Ben Hawes, and I wanted to raise the issue of the duties and responsibilities of public bodies and whether they're in the right place for this. I worked on government policy, mostly technology, for 15 years, including artificial intelligence, how intellectual property affects access to data and scientific research, and smart cities. My strong experience from this is that public bodies can only spend resources on things that are very clearly in their duties and responsibilities. They find it very hard to do anything else. And I find it hard to see any other outcome other than private companies occupying the territory of a more data-enabled world, unless we will actually give our public bodies stronger and broader and more specific duties.
Thanks. Any other questions? Oh. Josh.
Hi, I'm George Steve and I work at UCL. I want to pick up on what you were saying, Ian, about this tension between whether you want more innovation or more privacy in this kind of artificial choice that's created by politicians. Because I think in the conversation around technology and innovation that often comes up through things like the government's industrial strategy and the work of the government around AI and ethics, is that we want to make the UK the best place in the world to develop a company or do research in AI, and that's conventionally viewed as being lowering taxes or increasing the number of PhD students doing computer science or all these things. But actually there are opportunities outside that, like the UK could be the country that does the most thinking about what governance of data means or what the ethics means, and there are advantages which go beyond just funding science and thinking about education, but also thinking about some of these more ethical challenges first. But how do we actually go around that and capitalising on that? Because that seems to be in a really strong international playing field of other people investing, that seems a place where the UK could really prosper.
Thank you, George. Any other questions at the moment? Oh, one more.
Sorry, I'm a bit of an engineer, Sorry, I'm a bit of a novice at this, and I'm just slightly concerned from a humanitarian aspect. Tell me if I'm wrong. But if you build a house and say that this artificial intelligence is a house for thinking, as a metaphor, right? If you build a house that is not suitable for humanity to live in, it still may be a wonderful house, but it won't allow humanity to be very comfortable in it. Are there any checks and balances built into the system? There is a phrase, quis custodes custodiet, who governs the governors. And if we're handing over our humanity to a system that's greater than us, or we perceive it to be greater than us, what is there to stop it from saying, well, these little pink things aren't really good for us. The horror stories of science fiction, these people are getting in our way, etc., etc. If they really are artificially intelligent, of course, which they may not be.
Thanks. So, whoever wants to start.
I'll have a go. You're right. I think where we have to start in terms of governance and duties placed against public bodies is to first look into what are the enablers that are actually designed into the governance and accountability mechanisms of public bodies. Because often we regard legislation and guidance and rules as being, well, the guidance and rules being synonymous with legislation. They often are interpretations. So you need to go back to the source information. And that's where I would suggest we start, because I think there are times when we hold people accountable in a way that creates a lower risk appetite. So innovation, by definition, demands a level of risk-taking, but it should be intelligent and proportionate and governed risk-taking. So we do take risks every day in the public sector because people make decisions every day. And it sort of leads to your point, sir, that about just because we can doesn't mean we should. So where are the governors of that? And I remember being very struck by a presentation at DataFest in Edinburgh a few years ago, where we spoke about this leading edge of the human decision making, and that is the emotional intelligence. And interestingly, that is a skill set that is most apparent, not exclusive, to females. And that actually the change in how the workforce will work is the robotics, the automation. There will be a leading edge which requires very sophisticated sense-checking skills to say, is that device displaying learning that is not good for society? And I think there will always be a human element that has to be the governor of that environment. But you know more than I do on that, Ian, so I'm going to defer to you.
Well, no, I think that, you've this sort of question of, I think I remember it from Alan Moore, who watches The Watchmen. That is kind of the big unanswered question, unasked question in AI research right now. So I think that a few years ago, everyone, the sort of the larger arc here is that people got really, really excited about AI in 1950. And everyone said, right, let's make machines that are as smart as humans. And there was waves of progress and then periods of sort of stagnation and then waves of progress. And usually the hype crashed down. And for most of the time that I was kind of first interested in machine learning, you didn't talk about AI because it was kind of a dirty word. It was kind of like, that's what we talked about when people, when we kind of made a mistake last time round and thinking how good this was going to be. Right. And so I think largely as a result of sort of a handful of key companies, the progress that's been made in machine learning in the last 10 years has lent people to start talking about AI again and talk about this fundamental idea of creating truly intelligent machines. And then a few years back, progress got to a level where some people started saying, well, we need to make these machines safe. And AI safety went from being something where there were about, 2 people in the world working on it, to now there's maybe 50, right? So AI safety is kind of just starting to become something people are taking seriously as a technical discipline. But the underlying governance of AI is kind of where AI safety was, I think, a few years back. it's so early, and the sophistication in this conversation is very, very low. And the governance mechanics around all of the key companies don't really do anything to reflect the complexity of what they're dealing with. And so it's going to be a hot button topic. It's going to grow in importance, but it's just right at the outset right now. And again, one exciting thing about the UK is that probably the leading academic institution working on AI governance is in Oxford, the Future of Humanity Institute, and the key sort of researchers who probably are some of the most sophisticated thinkers in the world are in the UK. So, I don't think any of them are on the government's UK AI Council, unfortunately, but they would all be great people to consider. And to your point, Ben, about sort of the remit of government, I suppose. I think you're completely right. I think that ultimately you have to raise the bar of what government is stating it's trying to achieve if you want to have a hope of government sort of leading. And I think you have to have some kind of emissions-based approach where you say, in the UK we're going to do X with healthcare, and that will be the only way that the state will kind of be able to compete and have the resource to do so. So I think that you're completely right. I don't think that that's where we're at right now. I think it's much woollier, and it's much more about funding PhDs right now.
I think the work that they're leading in terms of that governance, the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation, is a really important body, because they are the thinkers leading the way, I think, into those changes at a political and policy level. And I do believe that we are on the edge of the next wave of this. And I mean, you referred to the waves that have happened from the 50s. And how do we actually choreograph the next wave? Because I think it feels as if we've ridden the wave on the surfboard. We've let it crest and then we've just crashed off the other side. Hopefully with no injuries, but sometimes there's pain and it makes you more risk averse. So what is the next wave, and how do you actually ride that with confidence? And that means that you have to have the political will, you have to have the mechanisms in government, be it mission-led collaborations, and that needs to be a change in the dynamic around holding public bodies to account for delivering innovation at a scale that probably is fairly challenging for people to think about.
I think the fundamental change, though, is going to be in the political leadership in lots of different countries. I mean, the reason that Google leads the world in this is because Larry Page is, an utterly brilliant executive and founder who has invested in machine learning and AI far ahead of what the market told him to do. And you won't get the state being able to do something similar if you don't have political leaders with some serious grasp of the topic. And I think that hopefully is what we see in various countries over the next few years.
Thanks. We are actually out of time. So thanks so much for a wonderful discussion today. So join me in applauding our speakers today. And since it was our last series, or last discussion in this series, I would also like to thank our own team members, Emily, Victoria, Lucas, Villa, Henry, Simona, everybody was here, and also Rob and Rolly from the British Library, but they're not here. So let's applaud them as well. They have done a wonderful job.